Shalom. Welcome to Light to the Nations. Today, we're going to be exploring the history of the tabernacle in the land of Israel, and moreover, we're going to be touching upon the relationship between the tabernacle and the temple, as it was eventually built on Mount Moriah. And in the particular halakha, which we're going to examine today in Maimonides, he's going to trace for us in a very succinct manner the history of the tabernacle. But you know, one of the questions which people ask very often regarding the tabernacle is, well, why don't we rebuild that now? And this is something that comes up very often whenever we're discussing the rather complex issue of the rebuilding of the temple. And many people wonder, well, if we have some sort of obstacle in the rebuilding of the temple now, why don't we just rebuild the tabernacle in the meantime? And actually, this question is made even more interesting by the fact that we believe that we actually know where the original components of the tabernacle are, where they were stored. But one of the things that we're going to see as we examine the words of Maimonides is that the tabernacle, for all practical purposes, really receded into history. And there is much that we can learn from now as far as the principles of the tabernacle and the parallels between the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the Mikdash, the Holy Temple. But the rebuilding of the tabernacle really has no place because of the fact that once Mount Moriah was established as the permanent location of the temple, this new reality changed everything, and there is really no going back to the tabernacle. But, still in all, before we really get into a discussion of today's section in Maimonides, I'm just thinking a little bit about the whole concept of the tabernacle and how it preceded the building of the temple, and those days of the kind of the honeymoon, in a way, the inauguration of the love between the Jewish people and the God of Israel, and what the tabernacle really represented then. And there's a very beautiful verse that comes to mind that I would like to state as an introduction, really, to this concept. It's in Jeremiah, chapter 2, the beginning of chapter 2. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, Thus says the Lord, I remember in your favor the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, when you did go after me in the wilderness, in a land that was not sown. Israel is holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his increase. All that devour him shall be held guilty. Evil shall come upon them, says the Lord. And this is very beautiful because it conjures up this imagery of the bride and the bridegroom, and Israel as a young nation not really knowing what to expect, but taking this leap of faith literally and jumping from Egypt and following God, being led by Moses into this barren wilderness. And God states here, I remember that kindness, as it were, that you bestowed upon me, God speaking to Israel, that you had that faith in me and that you followed me. Lech tech acharai bamidbar, the verse says. You followed after me into the desert, into a land that was not sown. And those were the days of the desert wanderings, the days of the tabernacle. And we find much of this type of analogy of this youthful love, this bride and groom imagery. Specifically in relationship to the tabernacle, we have a very beautiful midrash where Rabbi Judah the Prince, who was one of the important sages, and in fact who was the editor, or the codifier, as it were, of the Mishnayot, the Mishnah of the oral tradition, he sought to give an analogy to kind of illustrate the relationship between the tabernacle of the desert and the Holy Temple in Jerusalem through the following parable. And it's stated as follows in the Talmud and Tractate Ketubot about Rabbi Judah the Prince. Rabbi Judah the Prince arranged to marry off his son and agreed that he would provide for his livelihood for 12 years so that he would be able to continue with his studies unhindered. At the end of this period, the marriage would take place. So he's going to provide him with his living so that he wouldn't have to worry about that. And it was a prearranged marriage, like in the old days, and they would be married after 12 years. When the son was introduced to his betrothed, he was quite pleased and said, "Let the wedding take place in 6 years instead." And then when he had occasion to see his bride a second time, he said, "Let's have the wedding now, and then I shall go and continue with my studies." Now the boy thought that his father, Rabbi Judah the prince, might be annoyed with him on account of his efforts to bring forward the date of the wedding. But Rabbi Judah told him, "My son, on the contrary, you have acted just as God himself did. For the first verse in the Torah states, 'You shall bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the sanctuary God, which your hands have established,' is a reference to the building of the temple. And this actually, it's an important verse for us because it really shows us that the whole purpose of the splitting of the sea and coming out of Egypt was eventually to come in and to build the temple. So that's the first verse. And actually Rashi explains this verse to show us that when the Jews shall enter into the promised land, then they shall build the temple. But afterwards, suddenly, the Torah states, "And they shall make for me a sanctuary, that I will dwell among them," the verse that we were speaking about last week, the verse in Exodus 25. And as Rashi explains, now, in the desert. In other words, first God said, "Look, when you come into your inheritance, when you come in," Israel says to God in the song, "You shall bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the sanctuary God, which your hands have established." And then all of a sudden, the verse comes and says, no, God says, "You shall make for me a sanctuary," now in the desert. And this anecdote seeks to explain to us this spiritual connection between the earlier tabernacle and the temple, that even though the main objective of the commandment of Ve'asuli Mikdash Vashachanti Betocham, they shall make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell among them, the main objective of that commandment is to establish it permanently on Mount Moriah, which is the real location that God has chosen from the beginning of time. But on account of God's love for the Jewish people, just as the anxious groom in our story wants to hurry and marry his chosen bride because of the love that he feels, so too the Holy One sought to bring forward the time of his union with his chosen people. So that in itself is a very, very beautiful concept to understand as the history of the Jewish people unfolds, how this commandment was first fulfilled with the tabernacle. And so we have a recording in Maimonides. Actually, we're up to the second halacha in the laws of the Holy Temple, where Maimonides explains to us, kind of in a succinct way, he gives us a summary of the history of the tabernacle as it wandered through the land of Israel from the time that the Jewish people entered into the land until the temple was established in Jerusalem. And Maimonides tells us, since they entered into the land, Kevan shenichnasu la'aretz, ha'emidu hamishkan bagilgal 14 shana shekavshu v'shechalku. First of all, when the Jewish people entered into the land, the tabernacle was established in Gilgal for 14 years, while the land was being conquered and divided up between the tribes. There were 7 years, actually, of battle in which the land was to be conquered, and 7 years in which the land was actually portioned out to the tribes of Israel. So that was altogether 14 years. The 14 years of the tabernacle in the same format that it had been in the desert, the same type of structure, stood in Gilgal for 14 years. Afterwards, it stood in Shiloh. They came to Shiloh. And in Shiloh, the tabernacle stood actually for 369 years. And the tabernacle in Shiloh was very, very unusual and is a departure from our understanding until now of the structure of the tabernacle, because the tabernacle in Shiloh was actually a building of stone. However, it was an unroofed building, and it was covered over by the coverings, the skins of the tabernacle, so that in a way it was kind of like half and half. It was half permanent structure and half tabernacle of the desert was the stone building, as you can see in these illustrations, in this particular illustration that we are sharing with you now. It was a stone building, but it was covered over with the coverings of the desert tabernacle. And what this actually is illustrating as well, this particular painting, we see the high priest Eli, the Kohen Gadol, sitting at the entrance to the tabernacle, and in the foreground we see a woman. This is Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel, pouring out her heart to God, as we read about in the beginning of the book of Samuel. And this is actually a very, very important study in general, the whole concept of Hannah's prayer and how she approached God. There are many details of prayer that we actually learn from Hannah and from her attitude and the way she entreated God. And we read in Samuel how Eli, the high priest, originally thought that she was intoxicated. He didn't realize that she was actually just praying in her heart, that her lips were moving. She was uttering the prayer very quietly. And we're familiar with this prayer, and we can look at these verses and examine it in greater detail. I'd like to share with you a particularly moving midrash about this whole period in Jewish history that I think on many levels we can identify with. And it refers to this particular era, the tabernacle at Shiloh. And while it is a positive commandment for all of Israel to make the pilgrimage and to go up to be seen there by God at the sanctuary, which at this time was the tabernacle, apparently there were different periods in history, and people perhaps became a bit alienated from this commandment and stopped making the pilgrimage. And at one particular point, apparently, according to this midrash, which is in the Yalkut Shimoni, there were very, very few people going to make the pilgrimage. In fact, at this particular period, Elkanah, who was a very righteous individual, who was the husband of Hannah, the father of the prophet Samuel, Shmuel, Elkanah was the only Jew in the land that was making the pilgrimage. Why it's so, how the entire nation became disenfranchised from this commandment is another issue. But at this point, Elkanah was the only one who was really taking it seriously and going up to the festivals in the tabernacle. So the Midrash offers the following, that Elkanah and his wife Hannah and the members of his family would go up every year on the festival, and they would travel, they would traverse the land to go up to the tabernacle at Shiloh, and they would come and they would sleep outside in the public square. This is something that we have learned about, that when the Jewish people would make the pilgrimage to the temple, as we can see in another illustration here, the Mishnah tells us that the pilgrims would never enter any buildings on their way to Jerusalem. They used to sleep outside in the public square, and this is to circumvent a particular problem of perhaps becoming ritually impure if something were to happen under the roof of a home. So they, after having bothered to purify themselves to make the pilgrimage, they would sleep outside. So Elkanah and his entourage would make the pilgrimage, would be very, very public about it, very, very, in a way, flamboyant about it, because they would be attracting attention, they would be sleeping outside, and everybody would get very excited. Everybody who saw this stream of people would get very excited, and they would say to them, all the people along the way would say to Elkanah and his family, "Where are you going?" And they would respond, "We're going up to the house of God in Shiloh, because from there, Torah and mitzvot go out." And Elkanah would say, "And you, why don't you come with us, and we could go together?" And the Midrash says, this is just so amazing to me, the Midrash says, right away, all of these people in the towns, they would start to cry, and they would say, "We could go with you?" And Elkanah would say, "Yes." So one year, 5 households came, and the next year 10 households came, until eventually everyone began to renew this commandment and come up to Shiloh, to the tabernacle. And every year, the Midrash says, he would go a different way. One year he went on this path, and he would interest these people. He would, as it were, bring his message to this group of people, to this town, to these families. Another year he changed his route and had influence on another group of people, so that eventually what this Midrash in the Yalkut Shimoni is telling us is that this one individual, Elkanah, single-handedly reinstituted the commandment of coming up to the tabernacle and was single-handedly responsible for Israel's rekindling interest and action of going back to the tabernacle. And the Midrash concludes and says, the Holy One, blessed be He, has said to Elkanah, because you tipped the scale for Israel in the favor of their, in the balance of their favor, and you educated them, re-educated them in this commandment, and many received this merit through you, I will bring about through you a son, I will bring from you a son who will influence all of Israel to the scale of merits, and who will educate them in the commandments. In other words, the Midrash concludes, the merits that Elkanah received for this incredible activity that he undertook, this incredible project of really, as we read, single-handedly going out like a troubadour and rekindling the excitement amongst all of Israel to come to the tabernacle. The merit that he received, the reward that he received for that was in fact his son, the prophet Shmuel. So here I think this Midrash speaks so vividly about a time that certainly many of us can identify with, when there's a certain spiritual disillusionment and a certain kind of lackluster attitude about looking for God. Somehow, in a very short time, from the time the commandment was given, people lost interest, and so we find an era when only Elkanah himself went, and he took it upon himself to have an influence over the masses. And one of the things that we learn from this Midrash is the fact that one person can have such an incredible influence. Instead of just, he could have said, what could I do? I'm only one person. I'll just go and do the mitzvah myself. I'll go up to Shiloh. Instead, he wasn't satisfied with that, and he just trudged through every path in the land of Israel, met single-handedly every single Jew. He must have been, in his generation, the Jew who met personally on a first-name basis the most people of all, of one individual, because he went and had influence over all of these families and schlepped them back to God himself. He was the one who made all of these penitents, all of these Baalei Tshuva. And one of the amazing things I think that's very moving about this Midrash is that it says that wherever he would go, people would say to him, where are you going? And he said, I'm going up to Shiloh, to the house of God. Why don't you come? And they all started crying, we read, and they said, what, we could go with you? In other words, they felt like, who are we to look for God? He doesn't care about us. We're not going to bother going. And he said, of course you should go. That's the place of God and the Torah. So there are many, many things that I think that apply to our generation, how we can't give up on ourselves, how we can't give up on each other, and how every person has to take that responsibility and realize also, yes, this is for us, the Torah is for us, the pilgrimage is for us, God expects us to be there, and in the merit of that, may we see a prophet on the level of Shmuel. So Maimonides tells us, after Gilgal, that the tabernacle stood in Shiloh again for 369 years, and there it was a building of stone covered with the coverings of the tabernacle. And actually, this is something that our sages derive. The section in the Talmud in Tractate Zevachim, on page 118, actually describes how our sages realize this, because if you notice, there are certain verses, like this one in the book of Samuel, that refer to the tabernacle in Shiloh as a bayit, which means a building, a home of stone. And yet there are other verses, for example, like this one that we see in the book of Psalms, that refer to the structure in Shiloh as a mishkan, as a tabernacle. So our sages realized that this particular aspect of the history of the tabernacle was half and half. It was a building, but yet it was not yet completed. And then Maimonides continues and tells us that when Eli, the high priest, died and the tabernacle in Shiloh was destroyed, and then it went to Nov, and there the sanctuary was built in Nov. And you can really study more about the defeat of Israel at the hand of the Philistines and the capture of the ark and the death of Eli. You can read about that more in the book of Samuel, as you see here. After Shmuel passed away and the tabernacle in Nov was destroyed, it moved to Givon, and eventually after Givon it was established in Jerusalem as the Holy Temple. And this is what we're going to be studying about, and we'll just note that altogether, Nov and Givon together, the tabernacle stood there for a total of 57 years between Nov and Givon. Now, whenever we talk about the temple in Jerusalem, again, as we mentioned, the status of the Holy Temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem takes on an entirely different level of sanctity. And this is why, as I began our lesson today, it's unthinkable to consider the possibility of rebuilding the tabernacle, because a new reality came into being once the Holy Temple was established on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. The tabernacle is no longer a variable even. And as Maimonides states at the beginning of Halacha Gimel, the third halacha in his Hilchot Beit HaBechira, which we're studying now, once the Holy Temple was built in Jerusalem, all other places became forbidden to build there a house for God and to offer there an offering. In other words, a new principle became established, and that is that we, the Jewish people, can no longer consider the building of a house for God anywhere except there on Mount Moriah. That is the only place where an offering can be brought, and that is eternal, only in Jerusalem and on Mount Moriah. And in fact, there's a verse which we see here in the first book of Chronicles. In Hebrew it states, Vayomer David, Zehu Beit Hashem Ha'elokim v'zeh mizbeach le'olah liYisrael. David said, this is the house of Hashem, God, and this is the altar for Israel. And as God himself states through the verse in Psalms 132, this is my eternal resting place. Interestingly enough, while this is true, that according to halacha, according to biblical law, Jewish people may now only bring offerings to that place, the very specific place of the altar on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, actually righteous Gentiles, B'nai Noach, are permitted to bring offerings in other places throughout the world. And there is such a concept that the Talmud discusses, that it's possible for a righteous Gentile, under very specific circumstances and with guidance, to build an altar. But exactly where and how is quite a complicated issue. It has to be a place where we're certain that no idolatry was ever committed. But actually, a non-Jew could today, under certain circumstances, build an altar and bring an offering to God, whereas the Jewish people must wait for the reestablishment of the altar. It must be built exactly there on that place in Mount Moriah. And of course, we believe that the commandments of the offerings in the temple, the commandment of the temple, is viable, is real, and beckons to us to be fulfilled. And this is our entire purpose in studying the laws of the temple. We believe that the light of the Shekhinah, which dwells in the Holy Temple, will return to the world, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.